Workplace spirituality explores at how individuals and organisations engage with spiritual issues in the workplace context. It's a very general term though, so there are very varied lines of inquiry that explore that. Some authors believe it's a kind of backlash, if you like, that's sort of arisen from the 1990s to highly rationalist management practices, a kind of econophonic approaches to management, if you like, and counters that with a more holistic perspective that acknowledges that in managing people you have to consider subjective and objective aspects of human behaviour. Some studies have looked at meaning and purpose and how people bring a sense of meaning and purpose to their work. What's the point of what I'm doing? Is there a greater purpose in what I'm trying to do? And ironically, other researchers look at some quite quantitative outcomes of taking spiritual approaches to our work. So they might look at how a spiritual approach in an organisation has an effect upon staff morale. It might improve retention, or even correlations are drawn between the price of share prices. So in a kind of ironic way, they may look at quite quantitative measures to validate some highly subjective assumptions about the way human beings work best. Quite a few major organisations are adopting workplace spirituality approaches in their functions, and so Lucent, Ford, Harley-Davidson, Southwestern Airlines, Amway I think is fairly well known. So they're documenting some very positive outcomes in not just looking at quantitative outcomes to their work. I tend to pursue workplace spirituality in terms of what the implications might be for globalization, the intensification of globalization, and increased spiritual diversity. So how that diversity is managed. Well, over 20 years ago now, I ran my own consultancy, and I was invited to an organisation to their board meeting as part of familiarising myself with the client's organisational culture and how they did things. And I was really quite surprised at the time, because they began their meetings, their board meetings, with prayers. And in an otherwise very secular, or let's say non-spiritual working environment, it just seemed a very strange thing to do. And so I thought quite a lot about that afterwards. I thought, well, why did I feel sort of uncomfortable about that, and why was I a little bit embarrassed in that context, you know, to kind of experience that. And then it wasn't until a decade or so later that it really began to be a very well, one of the fastest growing areas of publication is workplace spirituality now. So from that early experience, when it was quite an unusual thing to happen, especially in Australia, now it's becoming quite a well-known line of inquiry. When I looked at the literature and the empirical research that had been undertaken, most of it had been carried out in the States. And the States isn't really culturally synonymous with Australia. We're much more secular, according to census reports, if you compare them, than the States. So I wanted to see what would happen if I conducted research here, and whether I'd get similar sorts of results. The research that I conducted in Australia was across 3 states and included a variety of professions and organisations. So some participants were accounting managers, others were in HRM, some were in the military, correctional services. So I interviewed people from public and private domains. And what I found was really quite surprising. I discovered, if you like, or I generated a theory from my research that identified personal and organisational spiritual identities. And when those identities are misaligned, it has the potential to lead to possible conflicts and sometimes negative outcomes for both the organisations and for the individuals concerned. So those negative consequences might be people leaving. It might be they may resign because they just have the feeling that they don't fit in. They might, where misalignments occur, there might be climates where negative humour and sarcasm is involved. Sometimes it might involve dismissals. So, for example, where communications are insensitive to someone's spiritual beliefs, it can lead to a dismissal. One of the things that surprised me about the research was that I thought, because Australia was highly secular and that I was going into organisations and interviewing non-religious, interviewing people from non-religious contexts, was one of my worries was, well, perhaps people will just tell me, no, there's nothing spiritual going on here. But I was very surprised at how every single participant had some sort of story to tell about how spirituality is an issue in their workplace from time to time. So, for example, if you think about extended trading hours for Sundays, or the fact that the shops are open in retail till late night at Christmas. So what does that mean when you're a manager and you're trying to work out the rostering of shifts, and somebody says, look, sorry, I'm going to midnight mass? You know, how much pressure, or can you coerce people to come to work during those times? Or mining companies need to be familiar with the spiritual value that Aboriginal people put on land, or they may need to be flexible in accommodating perhaps Aboriginal employees who need periods where they have community responsibilities. In hospitals, you've got patients and employees who have particular views about blood transfusions, perhaps working with organ donation or terminations. So sometimes people aren't always comfortable in fulfilling aspects of their role. So how would a health manager, for example, accommodate those kinds of needs? Most organisations are familiar with the need for perhaps prayer facilities, or those practical things like menus. It just, the list goes on and on. The military, the police, some retail organisations engage chaplains. So there's an assumption there that the workplace somehow has certain sorts of implications spiritually for people. So what are the expectations around those roles, if you like? Managers sometimes need to mediate in conflicts that arise about spiritual matters, where people don't always agree or feel threatened, and sometimes people can have intrapersonal conflict. So if you if the particular religion that you follow, for example, doesn't believe that birthdays should be celebrated, and it's part of the culture of the organisation on someone's birthday to bring in a cake, have a bit of a party, tell a story, what would that person do? In fact, one of the participants was telling me that they knew of someone who felt very uneasy. Do they participate and then run kind of counter to their own spiritual beliefs? Or do they not go and appear, you know, sort of grumpy and a bit strange because they're not going to a close colleague's birthday party? So is that not participating socially in expected ways? So there are a variety of kind of scenarios where it's not always easy for managers to work out how to approach those, you know, those kinds of incidents. So it can create dilemmas. Firstly, advice that I would give would be to make sure as a manager you're familiar with the law, and that in terms of discrimination laws and the responsibility that organisations have pertaining to spiritual and religious beliefs. Secondly, I'd suggest that they adopt a proactive approach, so to have some kind of strategies in place for communicating inclusive spiritual work environments, so everybody knows what the expectations are. And I think thirdly, to reconsider adopting avoidance tactics when those spiritual misalignments are evident, because it can be quite a sensitive subject, quite difficult to handle, quite complex. Managers quite often hope the problem goes away. So it may help to prevent things escalating if managers think about how they're going to act on things beforehand, and certainly engage with the issue instead of avoiding it. And thirdly, because of the have we got to fourthly? Because of the intensification of globalization, I think that university business schools have a real responsibility in preparing managers for the kinds of scenarios that I described somewhere in the curriculum.